The sun hung merciless over Yaga village, beating down on cracked earth that hadn't seen proper rain in 18 months. Dust devils danced between abandoned market stalls, carrying with them the whispers of broken promises and forgotten hopes. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the very atmosphere knew something momentous was about to unfold. President Ibrahim Traoré's convoy had arrived without fanfare. 3 aging land cruisers and a single military escort vehicle, their white paint dulled by the journey through the Sahel's unforgiving landscape. No television cameras, no press corps, no entourage of advisors in crisp suits. This wasn't a photo opportunity, it was a reckoning with reality. The village elders had swept the central square that morning, their weathered hands gripping worn brooms as they cleared away goat droppings and scattered millet husks. They worked in silence, their movements mechanical, born not of celebration, but of necessity. Years of broken promises from politicians had taught them to prepare without hope, to clean without expecting anything in return. Children pressed their faces against the gaps in compound walls, dark eyes wide with curiosity and caution. Their mothers pulled them back with gentle but firm hands, whispering warnings in local dialects that had survived centuries of conquest and change. "Stay close," they murmured. "Politicians bring trouble like storms bring lightning." Near the ancient baobab tree that had stood sentinel over Yaga for 3 centuries, a makeshift platform had been erected, rough wooden planks balanced on concrete blocks. A white canopy fluttered nearby, ready to provide shade for the distinguished visitor, but it would remain unused. Traoré had made it clear, if his people endured the heat, so would he. The president emerged from the lead vehicle slowly, his tall frame unfolding like a question mark against the harsh landscape. At 53, Ibrahim Traoré carried himself with the bearing of a man who had known both the weight of command and the burden of conscience. His face, deeply lined by years of sun and worry, bore the map of a country's struggles. Today, he wore no bulletproof vest beneath his simple white shirt, no dark sunglasses to shield his eyes from both sun and scrutiny. His security detail had argued vehemently against this decision, but Traoré had been adamant. "If I cannot trust my own people," he had said during the heated discussion in his office 3 days earlier, "then I have no business being their leader." Colonel Mensah, his head of security, had thrown his hands up in exasperation. "Mr. President, Zone 12 is still unstable. The rebels may have withdrawn, but their sympathizers remain. Intelligence suggests many things." Traoré had interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of too many briefings filled with maybes and possibilities. "But I know one thing for certain. These people have been abandoned for too long. They need to see their president as a man, not a myth." Now, standing in the dusty square of Yaga, with the hostile sun beating down on his uncovered head, Traoré wondered if his conviction would prove to be courage or foolishness. The crowd that had gathered was sparse and wary, perhaps 200 souls in total, men in worn boo-boo, women clutching babies to their chests, teenagers with eyes that had seen too much too soon. They formed a loose semicircle around the platform, maintaining the respectful distance that African protocol demanded, while keeping close enough to hear whatever promises or platitudes their leader had brought. Traoré stepped onto the platform without ceremony, the boards creaking under his weight. He surveyed the faces before him, some curious, some hostile, most simply tired. These were his people, the forgotten citizens of Zone 12, the ones who appeared in government statistics as numbers rather than names. "My brothers and sisters of Yaga," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. He spoke in French first, then switched to Moor, the language of his childhood, the tongue that connected him to the red earth beneath his feet. "I have not come to make promises. I have come to listen." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Politicians always came with promises. That was their currency, their trade. To come empty-handed was either refreshingly honest or dangerously naive. An old woman near the front, her, face a roadmap of 7 decades of joy and sorrow, called out in a voice cracked by years and dust. "Where were you when the rebels came? Where were your soldiers when our children were taken?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and accusatory. Traoré's security detail tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons, but the president raised a hand to still them. "I was in the capital," he replied, his voice carrying clearly, making decisions from behind a desk, reading reports from men who had never walked on this soil. "I was failing you." The admission stunned the crowd into silence. Leaders didn't confess weakness. They didn't acknowledge failure. They certainly didn't stand under the African sun and admit their shortcomings to people they would likely never see again. From somewhere in the middle of the gathering, a voice called out, "The rebels took my son, 12 years old. Have you come to tell me why?" Traoré's chest tightened. He had read the reports, seen the numbers. 347 children abducted from Zone 12 over the past 3 years. Most never returned. But standing here, facing a father's pain, statistics became flesh and blood. "I don't know where your son is," he said quietly. "But I swear to you, on my mother's grave, we will not stop looking." As he spoke, his eyes swept the crowd, cataloging faces, trying to memorize the names written in worry lines and hope-starved gazes. It was then that he noticed the boy. He stood near the front, no more than 13 years old, thin as a wishbone, and covered in the fine red dust that seemed to be a second skin for everyone in Zone 12. His clothes, a faded Manchester United jersey and shorts that had seen better years, hung loose on his small frame. But it was his eyes that caught Traoré's attention. They were ancient eyes, the kind that belonged to old men who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, not to children who should have been playing football or chasing chickens. The boy's name was Sadhu, though the president would not learn this until later. At this moment, he was simply another face in the crowd, another casualty of a war that had stolen childhoods and planted hatred in their place. Sadhu had not come to the square by choice. The voice on the satellite phone had been clear. "The president will be in Yaga tomorrow. You know what you must do." The phone had crackled with static, but the message was crystal clear. 3 years of careful cultivation had led to this moment. 3 years of whispered lies about betrayal, of carefully planted evidence of abandonment, of slowly building rage in a child's heart. But now, watching the man on the platform, Sadhu felt something unexpected: confusion. This wasn't the monster he had been taught to hate. This wasn't the coward who had left Zone 12 to burn. This was just a man, sweating in the sun like everyone else, speaking words that sounded dangerously close to truth. The memory surfaced unbidden: a soldier's boots, warm from another man's feet, slipped onto his own small ones 3 years earlier. "You matter," the soldier had said, and for a moment, a 10-year-old boy had believed it might be true. Traoré continued speaking, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. He talked about the challenges facing the region, about climate change and global commodity prices, about the complex web of factors that had left places like Yaga forgotten by progress. He didn't offer easy solutions or impossible promises. Instead, he offered something more valuable and infinitely more rare: honesty. "I cannot bring back the dead," he said, his voice carrying across the silent square. "I cannot undo the pain you have suffered, but I can promise you this: no more empty words. No more policies written by people who have never felt red dust between their toes. If we are going to rebuild, we rebuild together, from the ground up." He paused, letting his words settle like dust after a Harmattan wind. Then, stepping down from the platform, he began moving through the crowd. His security detail immediately tensed. This was not part of the plan. this impromptu walkabout among people who had every reason to hate him. "Mr. President," Colonel Mensa spoke urgently into his radio, "please return to the platform. This is not secure." But Traoré was already among his people, shaking hands with calloused farmers, listening to stories of drought and difficulty, looking directly into eyes that had forgotten what it felt like to be seen by their government. It was during this impromptu meet and greet that he found himself face to face with the boy. Sadhu stood frozen as the president approached, his right hand buried deep in his pocket, fingers wrapped around cold metal that seemed to burn against his skin. "What's your name, son?" Traoré asked, extending his hand with a smile that reached his eyes. The question was simple, innocent, human. But for Sadhu, it was a catastrophe. In all his preparation, in all the whispered instructions and careful planning, no one had prepared him for this moment of recognition, this simple acknowledgement of his humanity. His lips moved, forming words that wouldn't come. The name that had been carved into his heart by grief, Sadhu Ouedraogo, son of Musa and Fatima, survivor of the massacre at Compound 7, caught in his throat like a bone. Time slowed to the pace of honey flowing from a gourd. The president's hand remained extended, patient and kind. Around them, the crowd continued its murmured conversations, unaware that history balanced on the edge of a 13-year-old boy's decision. Then the shot cracked through the afternoon air like lightning splitting the sky. The bullet caught President Traoré in the chest just below his left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the red dust. Blood bloomed across his white shirt like a hibiscus flower opening in fast forward, bright and shocking against the pale fabric. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then chaos erupted like a dam bursting. Screams tore through the square as people scattered in every direction. Mothers grabbed children and dove behind market stalls. Old men who had seen too many coups and conflicts threw themselves to the ground, covering their heads with weathered hands. Vendors abandoned their few remaining goods, sending yams and cassava rolling across the dust. The president's security detail reacted with trained precision, weapons drawn, forming a protective circle around their fallen leader. Colonel Mensa barked orders into his radio while simultaneously scanning the crowd for threats, his eyes wild with the knowledge that his worst fears had been realized. But at the center of it all, two figures remained strangely still. President Traoré, despite the fire spreading through his chest and the blood dampening his shirt, had managed to stay upright on his knees. His face was pale, but his eyes remained clear, focused on the boy who stood before him, and Sadhu, small, thin Sadhu with his ancient eyes and borrowed hatred, stood frozen like a statue carved from the same red earth that surrounded them. The pistol, an old Soviet-era Makarov that had passed through dozens of hands over 3 decades of conflict, slipped from his fingers as if his body had suddenly remembered how to be a child. The weapon hit the ground with a dull thud, raising a small puff of dust that settled slowly, deliberately, like the dying echo of the shot that had changed everything. "Stop!" The word tore from President Traoré's throat with such force that even the chaos paused to listen. Blood flecked his lips, but his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Don't touch him!" The soldiers, who had been advancing on Sadhu with weapons raised and fury in their eyes, hesitated. Colonel Mensa, his radio still crackling with emergency responses, turned to stare at his president in disbelief. "Sir, the boy just shot you," the colonel said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "He's an assassin, a terrorist." But Traoré was looking at Sadhu, really looking at him. Past the dust and the thin frame and the shock-glazed eyes, he saw what Colonel Mensa and the others had missed. The absence of triumph, the complete lack of satisfaction that should have been written across the face of a successful assassin. Instead, there was only a hollow emptiness, as if someone had scooped out the boy's soul and left behind an echo. "He's a child," Traoré said, his voice growing weaker as shock began to set in. "A child doesn't decide to kill a president on his own." Sadhu hadn't moved. He stood transfixed, staring at the growing red stain on the president's shirt, at the man who was somehow still upright, still breathing, still looking at him with something that might have been compassion. The square had mostly emptied now, leaving only the security detail, a few brave villagers who had taken cover behind the baobab tree, and the boy who had just tried to assassinate his president. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of approaching sirens and the president's increasingly labored breathing. Dr. Aminata Traoré, the region's only doctor, arrived within minutes, her medical bag clutched in hands that shook with adrenaline. She had been listening to Traoré's speech from her clinic 2 blocks away when the shot rang out. Now she knelt beside the president in the dust, her trained hands assessing the damage while her mind cataloged the limited resources she had to work with. "The bullet missed the heart," she announced after a tense examination. "But he's losing blood fast. We need to get him to a proper hospital." "Ouagadougou?" Colonel Mensah asked, already calculating flight times and security protocols. "Too far," Dr. Traoré replied. "The regional hospital in Koudougou. It's not ideal, but it's our best option." As they prepared to move the president, Traoré's eyes found Sadou again. The boy was still standing in the same spot, swaying slightly like a tree in the wind, his face blank with shock. "Bring him," Traoré whispered to Colonel Mensah. "Sir?" "The boy. He comes with us." Colonel Mensah's expression suggested his president had lost his mind along with his blood. "Sir, with respect, that's not—" It wasn't a request. "Colonel." And so it was that Sadou found himself in the back of a military helicopter, flying over the landscape of his birth, while the man he had tried to kill fought for his life on a stretcher 3 feet away. Dr. Traoré worked frantically to keep Traoré stable, while 2 soldiers kept their weapons trained on the small figure huddled in the corner. Sadou's mind was a storm of confusion and memory. The plan had been simple: wait for the president to approach, fire 1 shot to the heart, then disappear into the chaos. The voice on the satellite phone had assured him that escape routes were prepared, that sympathizers would help him flee to safety. But there had been no escape route, no sympathizers. Only a boy standing over a bleeding man holding a smoking gun with nowhere to run and nothing left to believe. The memories came in fragments now, unbidden and unstoppable. The soldier who had given him boots 3 years ago, that had been Traoré, hadn't it? Before he became president, when he was just a colonel leading a peacekeeping mission in Zone 12. Sadou had been 10 years old, begging for salt in the marketplace of his village, his feet bare and bleeding from walking over broken glass. The man had knelt in the red dust, unlaced his military boots, and placed them in Sadou's small hands. "You matter," he had said in Moor, the language of home. "Remember that. You matter." 2 days later, the rebels had come anyway. Despite the promises of protection, despite the soldiers who were supposed to guard the village, the rebels had swept through like a plague, burning and killing and taking. Sadou had hidden in a grain silo while his parents were murdered in their own courtyard, had listened to his mother's screams fade into silence, had watched through a crack in the wood as his father tried desperately to protect a neighbor's child, and died for his kindness. In the years that followed, as Sadou was passed from relative to relative, from refugee camp to temporary shelter, the story had been retold and reshaped. The soldier who had given him boots became the colonel who had abandoned them. The man who had said, "You matter," became the leader who had decided they didn't. The voice on the satellite phone had been patient, persistent, kind even. It had taken months to build trust, to plant seeds of revenge in soil already poisoned by grief. "He betrayed your village," the voice had whispered through crackling static. "He promised protection and delivered death. Don't you want justice?" But now, watching Dr. Traoré fight to save the president's life, Sadou began to understand that he had been carrying someone else's hatred, someone else's agenda. The weight of it pressed down on his small chest like a stone. The regional hospital in Koudougou was a testament to the persistent hope and chronic underfunding that characterized much of West Africa's infrastructure. Built in the 1970s with aid money from 3 different European nations, it bore the architectural scars of compromise, French colonial angles mixed with German efficiency and Dutch pragmatism, resulting in a building that was functional but somehow never quite finished. President Traoré was rushed into surgery while Sadhu was led to a holding room in the basement. Not quite a cell, but close enough. The room had been hastily cleared of medical supplies and equipped with a single chair, a small table, and a guard who looked as confused as everyone else about why a would-be assassin was being treated as something other than a terrorist. Captain Kwame. Doumbia arrived at the hospital 3 hours after the shooting, driving through the night from his base in Ouagadougou. At 42, Doumbia was a career soldier who had seen conflict in 3 countries and peacekeeping missions on 2 continents. He had the weathered look of a man who had asked too many difficult questions and heard too many painful answers. His reputation preceded him. Doumbia was known as someone who could get information from anyone, but more importantly, he was known as someone who distinguished between enemies and victims. In a country where those lines were often blurred by politics and revenge, this made him both valuable and occasionally problematic for his superiors. Colonel Mensah had briefed him on the drive from the capital. 13-year-old boy. Clean shot, no apparent escape plan, strange reaction from the president. The kind of case that should have been straightforward, but felt complicated in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Doumbia found Sadhu sitting in the basement room, staring at his hands as if he had never seen them before. The boy hadn't spoken since the shooting, hadn't asked for water or food, hadn't even acknowledged the presence of the guards who rotated shifts outside his door. "Leave us alone," Doumbia told the guard, pulling the second chair up to face Sadhu directly. For several minutes they sat in silence. This was Doumbia's preferred interrogation technique. Not questions, not pressure, just the weight of shared silence until one party or the other felt compelled to fill it. He had learned long ago that people, especially children, would eventually talk if you simply waited and listened. Sadhu looked up once, briefly taking in the captain's uniform, the ribbons on his chest, the calm expression on his face. Then he returned to studying his hands as if they held secrets written in a script only he could read. "This isn't an interrogation," Doumbia said finally, his voice soft and conversational. "This is just 2 people sitting in a room trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense." Still no response. "I read your file," Doumbia continued. "Sadhu Ouedraogo. Born in Zone 12, parents killed in a rebel raid 3 years ago. Shuffled between relatives, spent time in 2 different refugee camps. Somehow ended up back in your home village just in time to shoot the president." At the mention of his parents, Sadhu's hands clenched slightly, the first physical reaction he had shown since being brought to the hospital. "That's quite a journey for a 13-year-old, Doumbia observed. "Lot of moving around. Lot of people who might have influenced a young man dealing with grief." The silence stretched again, but it felt different now, less empty, more pregnant with possibility. "You know what I find interesting?" Doumbia said, leaning back in his chair. "Most assassins, even young ones, they have an exit strategy. They have somewhere to go, someone to run to. But you just stood there, like you were waiting for something." For the first time since the shooting, Sadhu spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, cracked from disuse and emotion. "He gave me shoes." The words hung in the air between them, simple and complex at the same time. Doumbia had heard confessions, justifications, defenses, and pleas over his years of military service. But this was something else entirely. "Tell me about the shoes," Doumbia said. And slowly, haltingly like water seeping through cracked earth, Sadhu began to speak. He told Doumbia about the marketplace, about bare feet on broken glass, about a soldier who had knelt in the dust and treated a beggar child like a human being. He told him about watching his parents die, about the slow poison of revenge that had been fed to him over months and years, about the voice on the satellite phone that had made hatred feel like justice. As the boy talked, Doumbia began to see the outline of something larger, a conspiracy that had used a traumatized child as a weapon, that had taken a boy's grief and shaped it into a bullet aimed at the heart of the country's leadership. "Who gave you the gun?" Doumbia asked. Sadhu described a man who had appeared in Yaga 2 weeks before the president's visit. He had claimed to be a distant relative, had offered food and shelter and stories that made sense of senseless loss. The man had spoken of justice delayed and revenge denied, had painted President Traoré as the architect of Zone 12's suffering. He said the president had sold us to the rebels, Sadhu whispered. Said he took money to look the other way when they came for our villages. Doumbia made careful notes, his trained mind already beginning to trace the network that had weaponized a child's trauma. But there was something else nagging at him, something that didn't fit the pattern of typical political assassination attempts. Sadhu, he said gently, why didn't you aim for the head? The question seemed to surprise the boy, as if he hadn't considered it himself. I don't know, he admitted. When I saw him up close when he asked my name, he looked like the soldier. The one who gave me shoes. Because he was the soldier who gave you shoes, Doumbia said quietly. The realization hit Sadhu like a physical blow. His small body doubled over as if someone had punched him in the stomach. And for the first time since the shooting, tears began to fall. Dr. Aminata Traoré emerged from the operating room at 2:47 a.m., her scrubs stained with blood and her face etched with exhaustion. The bullet had missed President Traoré's heart by less than 2 centimeters, but it had nicked a major artery and caused significant internal bleeding. The surgery had taken nearly 6 hours. Colonel Mensah, who had been pacing the hospital corridors like a caged lion, immediately stepped forward. Doctor? He'll live, she said, pulling off her surgical gloves. But it was close. Very close. The next 48 hours will be critical. Word of the president's survival spread quickly through the hospital and then beyond, carried by cell phones and radio waves to every corner of Burkina Faso. In the capital, emergency cabinet meetings were convened. Opposition leaders made careful statements about unity in the face of violence. International partners expressed concern and offered assistance. But in a basement room of the Koudougou hospital, the news had a different impact entirely. Captain Doumbia had remained with Sadhu through the night, not interrogating now, but simply being present as the boy wrestled with the magnitude of what he had done and what he had been manipulated into doing. When word came that Traoré had survived the surgery, Sadhu's reaction was not relief, but a kind of terrified confusion. What happens to me now? He asked, his voice small in the concrete room. It was a fair question, and one that Doumbia didn't have a good answer for. By any measure of justice, Sadhu had committed attempted assassination of the head of state. The penalty for such an act was clear under Burkinabe law. But the circumstances, a manipulated child, a traumatized orphan, a conspiracy that had used grief as a weapon, complicated any simple application of legal consequences. That's not up to me, Doumbia replied honestly. But I can tell you this. The president asked specifically that you be treated well. Even after you shot him. This seemed to confuse Sadhu even more. In his understanding of the world, shaped by 3 years of trauma and manipulation, victims sought revenge, and power protected itself through violence. The idea that his target might show him mercy was alien to his experience. Throughout the night, other pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The mysterious relative who had appeared in Yaga with stories and weapons turned out to be a known operative of a rebel faction that had been thought dormant. The satellite phone that had delivered instructions was traced to a network that had been under intelligence surveillance for months. Sadhu had been recruited not because of any particular skill or commitment, but because his story was perfect for their purposes, a genuine victim of violence, a legitimate grievance against the government, and a child young enough to be molded but old enough to pull a trigger. They used you, Doumbia explained as dawn began to filter through the small window high on the wall. Your pain, your loss, your need for justice. They turned all of that into a weapon against the man who was actually trying to help. Sadhu was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Finally, he asked, "Why didn't he let them kill me? After I shot him, why did he protect me?" It was, Doumbia realized, the central question that would define not just this case, but potentially the future of a country that had seen too much violence and too little mercy. Ibrahim Traoré regained consciousness on the 3rd day after the shooting. The first thing he saw was the antiseptic white ceiling of the hospital room, harsh fluorescent lights creating patterns that reminded him of the security briefings that had filled too many of his mornings as president. The second thing he saw was Colonel Mensah, slumped in an uncomfortable chair beside the bed, his uniform wrinkled from 3 days of refusing to leave his post. "Mr. President," Mensah said, immediately alert despite his exhaustion, "how are you feeling?" The honest answer would have been terrible. Traoré's chest felt like someone had driven a truck through it. His arm was immobilized by bandages and tubes, and every breath sent shooting pains through his torso. But he had learned long ago that leaders were expected to bear pain quietly. "I've been better," he said, his voice hoarse. "How long?" "3 days, sir. You've been in and out of consciousness, but the doctors say you're past the worst of it." Traoré closed his eyes, trying to piece together the events that had led him to this hospital bed. The village square, the speech, the boy with ancient eyes, the crack of the pistol, the spreading warmth of blood on his shirt. "The boy," he said suddenly. "Is he alive?" Colonel Mensah's expression tightened. "Yes, sir. He's being held downstairs. Captain Dumbia has been conducting the preliminary investigation. I want to see him. Sir, I don't think that's advisable." "You're still recovering and—" "Colonel," Traoré interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had served him through 2 decades of military and political leadership. "I want to see him. Today." The request sent ripples of confusion and concern through the hospital's security detail. Presidents did not typically hold audiences with their would-be assassins. The protocol for such situations, if it existed at all, certainly did not include bedside visits. But Ibrahim Traoré had not built his career on following protocol. He had built it on making difficult decisions in impossible circumstances, on finding human solutions to inhuman problems. Dr. Traoré was called in to assess whether the president was strong enough for such a meeting. She examined him carefully, checked his vital signs, and asked a series of questions designed to evaluate his mental state. "Physically, you're stable enough for a brief meeting," she concluded. "But, Mr. President, are you sure this is wise?" "The trauma of a near-death experience can affect judgment and—" "Doctor," Traoré said with a weak but genuine smile, "I've been making unwise decisions my entire career. I'm not going to stop now." And so it was arranged. Sadu was brought from his basement room to the president's quarters, flanked by 2 guards and preceded by Captain Dumbia, who had volunteered to supervise the encounter. The boy looked even smaller in the hospital room, dwarfed by the medical equipment and the magnitude of what had brought him there. He had been allowed to wash and had been given clean clothes, simple, pants and a shirt donated by one of the hospital staff. But he still carried the weight of 3 days' worth of shock and revelation. President Traoré studied him carefully as he entered the room. Without the dust and desperation of the village square, Sadu looked like what he was, a child who had been handed an adult's burden of pain and manipulation. "Come closer," Traoré said gently. Sadu approached the bed hesitantly, his eyes fixed on the bandages visible above the president's hospital gown, on the tubes and monitors that testified to the damage he had caused. "I'm sorry," Sadu whispered, the words barely audible. "I know you are," Traoré replied. "But sorry isn't what I want to talk about." He gestured to the chair beside his bed. "Sit down. Tell me about your parents." For the next hour, in the antiseptic quiet of the hospital room, President Ibrahim Traoré and Sadu Ouedraogo talked, not as leader and subject, not as victim and perpetrator, but as 2 people trying to make sense of senseless loss. Sadu spoke about his father, Musa, who had been a subsistence farmer and part-time mechanic, who could fix any machine but had never owned one newer than his grandfather's bicycle. He talked about his mother, Fatima, who had sold groundnut paste in the market and sung lullabies that could chase away nightmares and hunger in equal measure. Traoré listened without interruption, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped the boy find words for experiences that had lived in the realm of unspeakable trauma for 3 years. When Sadu finished, Traoré was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "I wasn't there when your parents died. But I was responsible for the policies that left your village unprotected. The chain of command that failed you starts with me." "But you gave me shoes," Sadhu said, confusion evident in his voice. "I gave you shoes," Traoré agreed. "But I failed to give your family safety." One doesn't excuse the other. The boy struggled with this, his young mind trying to reconcile competing narratives of blame and responsibility, of individual kindness and systematic failure. "What happens to me now?" Sadhu asked, echoing the question he had posed to Captain Doumbia 3 nights earlier. President Traoré had been asking himself the same question since regaining consciousness. By any legal standard, Sadhu had committed a serious crime. By any political calculation, showing mercy to an assassin could be seen as weakness. But Ibrahim Traoré had long ago learned that sometimes leadership meant choosing the harder path, the one that made sense in terms of healing rather than headlines. "That depends," he said finally, "on what you want to do with the rest of your life." 6 weeks later, President Traoré stood in his office in Ouagadougou, studying a development proposal that would have been impossible to imagine 2 months earlier. The documents spread across his mahogany desk outlined a comprehensive reconstruction plan for Zone 12, not the kind of top-down, capital-intensive project that usually emerged from government ministries, but something organic, community-based, built from the ground up. The plan had come together through a series of unlikely conversations. It had begun with Captain Doumbia's investigation, which had revealed not just the network that had recruited Sadhu, but the deeper structural problems that made such recruitment possible. Children without schools became soldiers. Farmers without land became rebels. Communities without hope became breeding grounds for violence. But the plan had taken shape through something more powerful than policy analysis. It had grown from President Traoré's bedside conversations with a 13-year-old boy who had tried to kill him. During his recovery, Traoré had continued to meet with Sadhu regularly. The meetings were unorthodox, probably inappropriate, and certainly problematic from a security standpoint. Colonel Mensah had objected repeatedly, citing protocols and procedures and the simple fact that having regular conversations with one's attempted. Assassin was not standard presidential behavior, but the conversations had revealed something that all the intelligence, briefings, and policy papers had missed. Zone 12 wasn't just a security problem or an economic challenge. It was a community that had been systematically abandoned, where the social fabric had been torn by violence and left unrepaired by neglect. The school closed 3 years ago, Sadhu had explained during one of their talks. The teacher left after the rebels took his wife. No one came to replace him. What about the clinic? Burned down. They said it was an accident, but everyone knew the rebels did it because the doctor was treating government soldiers. The police post? Empty since the attack. The sergeant was transferred and they never sent anyone else. People handle their own problems now. Each conversation had revealed another layer of institutional failure. Another example of how the state's retreat from Zone 12 had created a vacuum filled by violence and desperation. But the boy's words had also revealed something else. A detailed understanding of his community's needs. An intimate knowledge of what had worked before and what might work again. "Your father was a mechanic," Traoré had observed during one visit. "Were there others?" 3 or 4. They could fix anything, tractors, water pumps, solar panels, but they had no parts, no tools. When something broke, it stayed broken. "And your mother sold ground nuts?" "Best in the region," Sadhu had said with the first genuine smile Traoré had seen from him. She had a secret recipe for the paste. Women would come from 3 villages over to buy from her. What happened to the recipe? The smile had faded. Buried with her. But as their conversations continued, President Traoré began to see the outline of something that could work, a reconstruction plan that built on existing knowledge and relationships rather than imposing solutions from outside. Now, 6 weeks later, the plan was taking shape on paper. A technical school that would train young people in the mechanical and agricultural skills the region desperately needed. A women's cooperative that would revive traditional food processing techniques while connecting to modern markets. A community health center staffed not just by doctors from the capital, but by local people trained in basic medical care. Most importantly, the plan included something unprecedented in government development programs. community leadership positions for people who had lived through the conflict, including those who had been on the wrong side of it. Mr. President, his chief of staff, Marie Cabor said from the doorway, "The cabinet meeting is ready to begin." Traoré gathered the documents, knowing that the next hour would be one of the most important of his presidency. The proposal was bold, expensive, and politically risky. It involved working with former rebels, trusting communities that had been designated as security threats, and most controversially, giving a prominent role to a boy who had tried to assassinate the head of state. The cabinet room was tense as Traoré entered. Word of the Zone 12 proposal had leaked, as government secrets always did, and the ministers were clearly divided. Some saw opportunity in the president's survival, a chance to demonstrate mercy and healing that could become a powerful political narrative. Others saw dangerous precedent. What message did it send to show mercy to would-be assassins? "Gentlemen, ladies," Traoré began, taking his seat at the head of the long table, "I know there are concerns about the Zone 12 proposal. Let me address them directly." He spent the next 20 minutes outlining the plan in detail, explaining the economic rationale, the security implications, and the potential for replicating the model in other conflict-affected regions. But he saved the most controversial element for last. The plan includes a provision for Sadou Ouedraogo to serve as a youth coordinator for the reconstruction project, he said, his voice level and calm despite the immediate murmur that ran around the table. Minister of Justice Amadou Diallo leaned forward, his expression incredulous. "Mr. President, with all due respect, you're proposing to give a government position to someone who tried to kill you. The precedent, Traoré interrupted, is that we are a nation capable of distinguishing between children who have been manipulated and adults who manipulate them. Sadou Ouedraogo was 13 years old, traumatized, and systematically deceived about the circumstances of his parents' death. He is not a terrorist. He is a victim who was turned into a weapon." Minister of Defense Colonel Yameogo, a man whose career had been built on clear distinctions between friends and enemies, shook his head. "Mr. President, I understand the desire for mercy, but mercy must be balanced with justice. The boy committed a serious crime." "Yes, he did," Traoré agreed, "and he will face consequences for it. But those consequences should serve the goal of rebuilding our country, not just satisfying our desire for punishment." The debate continued for over an hour, with ministers raising practical concerns, political risks, and security implications. Some worried about the message it would send to other potential dissidents. Others questioned whether a 13-year-old could handle the responsibilities being proposed. Finally, Minister of Social Affairs Beatrice Traoré, no relation to Dr. Traoré, raised the question that everyone was thinking but no one had dared to ask directly. "Mr. President, why are you doing this?" "Really? Beyond the policy arguments and the reconstruction plans, why are you taking this personal risk for this particular boy?" Ibrahim Traoré was quiet for a long moment, considering how to articulate something that he was still trying to understand himself. Finally, he said, "Because 3 years ago I gave a hungry child a pair of boots and told him he mattered. Then I failed to create a system that proved those words true. That failure nearly cost me my life. And it did cost Sadou his childhood." He looked around the table at the faces of the men and women who helped him govern a country that had seen too much conflict and too little hope. "I could have Sadou tried as an adult, sentenced to life in prison, and moved on with the business of governing. That would be justice of a sort. Or I can try to prove to him and to every other abandoned child in Zone 12 that when I say they matter, I mean it. That's not just justice. That's the kind of leadership this country needs." The vote, when it came, was closer than Traoré would have liked. 7 in favor, 4 against, 1 abstention. But it was enough. The morning sun painted the landscape of Zone 12 in shades of gold and rust as the small convoy made its way toward Yaga. It was a different kind of presidential visit this time. No speeches, no crowds, just a handful of vehicles carrying the people who would begin the work of rebuilding a forgotten corner of the country. Sadou sat in the back of the second vehicle, watching the familiar landscape roll past the window. Everything looked the same. the scattered villages, the stubborn baobab trees, the red earth that seemed to hold memory in its very grains. But his perspective had changed so dramatically that it might as well have been a different planet. The past 6 weeks had been a whirlwind of preparation, training, and adjustment. After President Traoré's cabinet had approved the Zone 12 reconstruction plan, Sadhu had been transferred from his hospital room to a government guest house in Ouagadougou, where he had begun an intensive program of education and preparation for his new role. The program had been designed by Dr. Sarah Cohn, a psychologist who specialized in working with child soldiers and young people affected by conflict. She had approached Sadhu's case not as a criminal matter, but as a rehabilitation challenge. How do you help a traumatized child process grief, guilt, and manipulation while preparing him to become a constructive member of society? Healing isn't forgetting, Dr. Cohn had explained during one of their early sessions. It's learning to carry the weight of your experiences without letting them crush you. The sessions had been difficult. Sadhu had been forced to confront not just the shooting, but the 3 years of carefully cultivated hatred that had led to it. He had to acknowledge how his grief had been manipulated, how his legitimate anger at injustice had been twisted into something destructive. But the sessions had also revealed something else. Despite everything he had been through, Sadhu retained a deep understanding of his community's needs and a genuine desire to help. His experiences as an orphan, a refugee, and eventually a weapon had given him insights that no government official could match. You know what it's like to be abandoned, Dr. Cohn had observed. That knowledge could be your greatest asset in making sure other children don't experience the same abandonment. Now, as the convoy approached Yaga, Sadhu felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. He was returning to the place where he had tried to kill a man, but he was returning with a purpose that went beyond personal redemption. The village looked different than it had 6 weeks earlier. Construction materials were piled near the old school building. Concrete blocks, corrugated metal sheets, bags of cement that represented the beginning of something new. A temporary clinic had been established in a renovated compound, staffed by Dr. Traoré and 2 nurses who had volunteered for the challenging assignment. Most importantly, people were moving back. Families who had fled during the worst of the conflict were returning, drawn by word that Zone 12 was finally receiving the attention it had been promised for years. President Traoré had arrived 2 days earlier, not for a public event, but for working meetings with community leaders, local officials, and the various specialists who would oversee different aspects of the reconstruction. His presence in the village was still unusual enough to draw curious crowds, but the atmosphere was different now, less desperate, more hopeful. Sadhu's return was met with a complex mixture of reactions. Some villagers viewed him with suspicion, the boy who had tried to kill their president, regardless of the circumstances. Others saw him as a victim who deserved compassion. Still others were simply curious about this young person who had somehow become central to their community's future. But it was the children who provided the clearest indication of how Sadhu would be received. Within hours of his arrival, a small group of boys and girls, some his age, others younger, had gathered around him, asking questions, sharing stories, and gradually accepting him back into the complicated social fabric of rural childhood. Among them was Aicha, a 12-year-old girl who had lost her father in the same rebel raid that had killed Sadhu's parents. She had been living with an aunt in a neighboring village but had returned with her family when word spread that Yaga was being rebuilt. "Is it true you shot the president?" she asked with the directness that only children could manage. "Yes," Sadhu replied, seeing no point in lying or softening the truth. "Why?" "Because I was angry and hurt, and someone convinced me that hurting him would make the pain go away." "Did it?" "No, it made everything worse." Aicha considered this for a moment. "My aunt says anger is like carrying hot coals. It burns you more than anyone else." The wisdom of the comment struck Sadhu forcefully. For 3 years he had carried hot coals in his chest, letting them burn away his childhood, his judgment, and nearly his future. Only now was he beginning to understand the weight of what he had been carrying and the relief of finally setting it down. The reconstruction of Zone 12 began not with grand gestures or ribbon-cutting ceremonies, but with the mundane work of foundation laying and community organizing. Sadhu's role as youth coordinator meant he spent his days moving between different projects, translating between the technical language of development specialists and the practical concerns of villagers who had learned to be skeptical of promises from outsiders. His first major task was helping to establish the technical school that would train young people in the skills Zone 12 needed most. The building itself was being constructed on the site of the old elementary school, which had been abandoned since the teacher's disappearance 3 years earlier. Working with Kofi Asante, a Ghanaian engineer who had experience in post-conflict reconstruction, Sadhu helped identify the specific technical skills that would have the greatest impact on the community's recovery. The curriculum they developed was practical and immediately applicable. Basic mechanics, small-scale agriculture, solar panel installation and maintenance, water pump repair, and construction techniques appropriate for the local climate and available materials. But the most innovative aspect of the program was its integration of trauma counseling and conflict resolution into the technical training. Dr. Coney had insisted that any program serving young people in Zone 12 needed to address not just skills gaps, but the psychological impact of years of violence and instability. You can't build a peaceful community with traumatized individuals. She had explained to the project planning committee, technical skills without emotional healing is like building a house on a cracked foundation. Sadhu's own experience made him uniquely qualified to help identify young people who might benefit from the program. He could recognize the signs of manipulation and radicalization that he had missed in his own experience, and his story of redemption provided a powerful example for other youth who might be struggling with anger and despair. One of the first students to enroll was Mahmoud, a 15-year-old who had spent 2 years with a rebel group before escaping during a government offensive. Like Sadhu, Mahmoud carried the weight of actions he had been forced to take as a child. And like Sadhu, he was struggling to find a way forward that didn't involve violence. "They told us we were fighting for justice," Mahmoud confided to Sadhu during one of their conversations. "But all I ever saw was people getting hurt." "What do you want to do now?" Sadhu asked. "Learn something useful. Build something instead of destroying it." The conversation took place while they were working together to repair a borehole that had been damaged during the conflict. The pump mechanism was old and temperamental, requiring the kind of patient, methodical approach that couldn't be rushed or forced. As they worked, Mahmoud talked about his experiences with the rebels, his escape, and his hopes for the future. Sadhu listened without judgment, remembering his own conversations with President Traoré and Captain Doumbia, and how powerful it had been to simply be heard without being condemned. "Do you think people will ever trust us?" Mahmoud asked as they finally got the pump working, sending clear water flowing for the first time in months. "I think people want to trust us," Sadhu replied, watching villagers gather around the borehole with containers to fill. "But trust has to be earned, every day, with every choice we make." The work was slow and sometimes frustrating. Rural development had a different pace than urban politics, and progress was measured in small increments rather than dramatic breakthroughs. But gradually, the community began to show signs of recovery that went beyond physical reconstruction. The women's cooperative that had been established to revive traditional food processing techniques was thriving. Under the leadership of Mama Konate, a 60-year-old widow who had maintained her groundnut paste recipe through years of conflict and displacement. The cooperative was providing income for 23 women and supplying products to markets as far away as Ouagadougou. The community health center was treating an average of 40 patients per week, providing basic medical care that had been unavailable in Zone 12 for over 3 years. Dr. Traoré had trained 6 local women in basic health skills, creating a network of community health workers who could handle routine problems and identify serious cases that needed to be referred to better-equipped facilities. Most importantly, the school was operational again. 37 children were attending classes in a renovated building, taught by 2 teachers who had been recruited from among local people with secondary education and given intensive training in pedagogy and child psychology. 6 months after Sadhu's return to Zone 12, President Traoré made another visit to assess the progress of the reconstruction project. This time, he came not as a politician seeking photo opportunities, but as a leader trying to understand whether an experiment in mercy and practical development could actually work. The changes were visible immediately. The village that had been characterized by dust and desperation now showed clear signs of renewal. New construction was evident everywhere. Houses with corrugated metal roofs instead of thatch, a renovated market building with proper stalls for vendors, solar panels providing electricity to the school and health center. But the most significant changes were less tangible. There was a sense of activity and purpose that hadn't been present during Traoré's previous visits. People moved with the confidence of those who had work to do and hope for the future. Children played in the streets without the furtive, fearful quality that had characterized their behavior during the worst years of the conflict. Sadhu met the president at the edge of the village, walking alongside the official convoy as it made its way to the community center where a briefing had been arranged. At 14 now, he had grown several inches and filled out considerably, his face losing some of the gaunt, haunted quality that had characterized his appearance 6 months earlier. "How are you, Sadhu?" Traoré asked as they walked. "Better," the boy replied. "Different? Different how?" Sadhu considered the question carefully. "Before I carried anger everywhere I went. Now I carry responsibility instead. It's heavier, but it doesn't burn." The briefing that followed was comprehensive and encouraging. The technical school had graduated its first class of 15 students, all of whom had found employment either locally or in neighboring communities. The women's cooperative was profitable and expanding. The health center had reduced child mortality in the region by 40% and had successfully contained 2 outbreaks of preventable diseases. But the most impressive statistics were those related to security and conflict prevention. There had been no rebel recruitment in Zone 12 for 6 months, no incidents of intercommunal violence, and a significant reduction in petty crime and domestic disputes. The key, explained Captain Dumbia, who had been assigned as the security liaison for the project, has been addressing root causes rather than just symptoms. When young people have opportunities, they're less likely to be recruited by extremist groups. When communities have resources, they're less likely to fight over them. President Traoré toured the various projects, meeting with beneficiaries and asking detailed questions about sustainability and replication potential. But he reserved his longest conversation for a private meeting with Sadhu, conducted in the same spot where the shooting had taken place 8 months earlier. "Do you ever think about that day?" Traoré asked, settling onto a wooden bench that had been placed under the ancient baobab tree. "Every day," Sadhu replied, "but differently than I used to." "How so?" "Before, I thought about it as the day I tried to kill you. Now I think about it as the day everything changed, for me, for this community, for what's possible when people choose mercy over revenge." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching children play in the square where violence had once erupted, where blood had soaked into red earth that now nurtured new growth. "I have something for you," Traoré said finally, reaching into a small bag he had brought with him. He pulled out a pair of boots, not new ones, but the same military boots he had given to a hungry 10-year-old boy 4 years earlier. Sadhu stared at them, recognizing immediately the scuffed leather and worn soles that had carried him through the worst years of his life. "I had them retrieved from your family's compound after the attack," Traoré explained. "I thought you might want them back." Sadhu took the boots carefully, running his fingers over the familiar creases and stains. They were too small for him now. His feet had grown considerably in the past year, but their symbolic weight was enormous. "I kept them because they reminded me that I mattered," he said quietly, "even when everything else told me I didn't." "You do matter," Traoré said. "You always did. What happened to your family? What you went through afterward? What you were manipulated into doing? None of that changed the fact that you matter." "I know that now," Sadhu replied, "and I want to make sure other kids know it too." News of the Zone 12 reconstruction project had begun to attract attention beyond Burkina Faso's borders. International development agencies, academic researchers, and journalists were taking note of an approach that seemed to be achieving remarkable results in a challenging environment. Dr. James Whitfield, a conflict resolution specialist from Oxford University, arrived in Zone 12 9 months after the project began, intending to spend 2 weeks studying the methods being used. He ended up staying for 6 months, eventually co-authoring a research paper that would become influential in post-conflict development circles. What's unique about Zone 12, Dr. Whitfield explained in an interview, is that it doesn't treat reconciliation and development as separate processes. Instead, it integrates healing, economic opportunity, and community rebuilding into a single comprehensive approach. The key innovation, he argued, was the project's willingness to work with people who had been on different sides of the conflict, including those who had committed acts of violence. Rather than excluding former combatants or treating them purely as security threats, the Zone 12 model sought to understand the root causes of their involvement and address those causes through education, economic opportunity, and psychological support. Sadhu Ouedraogo is the most visible example, Dr. Whitfield noted, but he's not the only one. The project has successfully reintegrated dozens of young people who had been involved with armed groups, turning potential security threats into community assets. The success was attracting visitors from across West Africa and beyond. Delegations from Mali, Niger, and Chad came to study the methods being used. Representatives from international organizations, including the World Bank, USAID, and the European Union made fact-finding missions to assess whether the Zone 12 model could be replicated elsewhere. But perhaps the most significant validation came from within Burkina Faso itself. Other regions that had been affected by conflict began requesting similar programs. The government, initially skeptical of President Traoré's unconventional approach, found itself under pressure to expand the model to other areas. "We're seeing results that we couldn't have imagined," admitted Minister of Defense Colonel Yameogo, who had been one of the most vocal critics of showing mercy to Sadhu. "Violence is down across the region. Recruitment by extremist groups has virtually stopped, and economic indicators are showing consistent improvement." The political implications were significant. President Traoré, who had been seen as potentially vulnerable after the assassination attempt, found his approval ratings rising as news of the Zone 12 success spread. Opposition leaders who had initially criticized his soft approach to terrorism found themselves struggling to argue against results that were undeniably positive. But for Sadhu, the external attention was less important than the daily reality of seeing his community continue to heal and grow. He had been promoted to regional youth coordinator, responsible for helping establish similar programs in 3 neighboring provinces. The work required extensive travel, long hours, and constant problem-solving, but it provided something he had never experienced before, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal survival. His days were filled with meetings with local leaders, training sessions for new program participants, and the endless paperwork that came with managing development projects. But the most rewarding moments came when he encountered young people who reminded him of his former self, angry, traumatized, looking for someone to blame for their pain. One such encounter came during a visit to a village in the neighboring province, where he met Fatima, a 13-year-old girl whose parents had been killed in a suicide bombing that had targeted a market. She had been living with relatives who struggled to provide for her, and she was showing signs of the kind of despair and anger that made young people vulnerable to radical recruitment. "Everyone says I should forgive and move on," Fatima told him during their first conversation. "But I can't. The anger is all I have left of my parents." Sadhu recognized the logic immediately. He had used similar reasoning to justify his own hatred, his own thirst for revenge. "The anger isn't what you have left of your parents," he replied gently. "It's what someone else planted in the space your parents used to fill. Your parents' legacy is love, not hatred." "How do you know?" she challenged. "Because I know what it's like to carry anger until it burns away everything else that matters. And I know what it's like to discover that there's something better on the other side of that anger." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Sadhu sharing his own story, not as a lecture but as an offering of understanding. He talked about the boots, about the manipulation, about the moment when the gun slipped from his fingers and he realized that revenge had solved nothing. By the end of their talk, Fatima had agreed to enroll in the local youth program, beginning a journey that would take her from victim to survivor to community leader. 2 years after the shooting in Yaga village, President Ibrahim Traoré stood once again under the ancient baobab tree. But this time he was not alone on a makeshift platform. Instead, he was part of a crowd of nearly 1,000 people who had gathered for the official inauguration of the Zone 12 Community Development Center. The center was the culmination of 2 years of patient work. A complex of buildings that housed a expanded technical school, a regional health clinic, a women's cooperative headquarters, and administrative offices for the various development programs that were now operating throughout the region. But more than a collection of buildings, the center represented a new model for post-conflict development that was attracting attention from around the world. Delegations from over 20 countries were present for the inauguration, along with representatives from major international organizations and media outlets. Sadu, now 16 and serving as the National Coordinator for Youth Reintegration Programs, was one of the featured speakers at the ceremony. Standing at the same podium where President Traoré had been shot 2 years earlier, he looked out at an audience that included former rebels, former soldiers, conflict victims, and community leaders who had all somehow found ways to work together toward common goals. 2 years ago, I stood in this same place and tried to kill the man who had shown me the greatest kindness of my young life, Sadu began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. I did it because I had been taught that hatred was stronger than hope. That revenge was more satisfying than rebuilding. He paused, letting his words settle over an audience that included many people who had faced similar choices between revenge and redemption. I was wrong, he continued. Hatred is not stronger than hope, it's just louder. Revenge is not more satisfying than rebuilding, it's just easier, at least in the short term. But easy and right are not the same thing. The speech that followed traced the journey of Zone 12 from a forgotten backwater plagued by conflict to a model community that was attracting visitors from around the world. But Sadu focused not on statistics or policy innovations, but on the personal stories of transformation that had made the larger success possible. He talked about Mahmoud, the former child soldier who had become one of the most skilled mechanics in the region and was now training other young people in technical skills. He spoke about Mama Konate, whose groundnut paste was being sold in markets across West Africa, providing income for dozens of women and their families. Most importantly, he talked about the children who were growing up in Zone 12 now, children who had never known war, who attended school regularly, who had access to health care and economic opportunities, who were being raised in a community that had chosen healing over hatred. These children will grow up knowing that conflicts can be resolved without violence, that former enemies can become partners, that even the deepest wounds can heal if we have the courage to choose mercy over revenge, Sadu said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. They are our real victory. They are our proof that another way is possible. When Sadu finished speaking, the applause was long and heartfelt, but it was the response of one person in particular that moved him most deeply. President Traoré, who was sitting in the front row, stood and began clapping, and as he did, tears were visible on his cheeks. After the ceremony, as the crowds began to disperse and the international visitors made their way to a reception at the community center, Traoré and Sadu found themselves alone once again under the baobab tree. "I'm proud of you," the president said simply. "I'm grateful to you," Sadu replied, "for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself, for choosing to trust me when I didn't deserve trust." "Everyone deserves trust," Traoré said. "Sometimes they just need help remembering how to earn it." They stood together in comfortable silence. Two men whose lives had been forever changed by a moment of violence that had somehow been transformed into a foundation for peace. As the sun began to set over Zone 12, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sadu thought about the boots that sat in a place of honor in his small apartment. Too small for his feet now, but still carrying the weight of a promise fulfilled. "You matter," a soldier had told a hungry boy 4 years earlier. And those words had survived manipulation, betrayal, violence, and despair to become the foundation of a new kind of community. In the distance, children were playing football in the square, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. They were the generation that would inherit Zone 12's legacy of reconciliation, the proof that mercy could indeed be stronger than revenge when backed by genuine commitment to justice and healing. 5 years after the shooting that nearly killed a president and almost destroyed a boy's future, Zone 12 had become something unprecedented in the annals of post-conflict development. A genuine success story. The statistics were impressive by any measure. Child mortality had dropped by 60%. School enrollment had reached 98%. Youth unemployment had fallen from 80% to less than 15%. There had been no incidents of political violence in over 3 years, and recruitment by extremist groups had virtually ceased throughout the region. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real measure of success could be seen in the faces of children who played without fear, in the confidence of women who ran successful businesses, in the pride of young men who had chosen construction over destruction. The Zone 12 model had been replicated in 12 other regions across Burkina Faso and was being adapted for use in 6 other countries. International development organizations were funding research to understand why the approach worked so well and how it could be scaled up more broadly. Sadou Ouedraogo, now 21 years old, had completed his university education with a degree in conflict resolution and community development. He had written a book about his experiences, established a foundation that worked with traumatized youth across West Africa, and had been invited to speak at conferences around the world. But he still returned to Yaga regularly, still lived in a simple house near the community center, still worked directly with young people who were struggling with the legacy of violence and trauma. President Ibrahim Traoré, re-elected twice since the shooting, was serving his final term in office. He had announced that after leaving the presidency, he planned to establish an institute dedicated to studying and promoting reconciliation-based development approaches. What happened in Zone 12 wasn't a miracle, he said during a recent interview. It was the result of very deliberate choices made by very ordinary people who decided that mercy was more powerful than revenge. That building was more satisfying than destroying. On the 5th anniversary of the shooting, Traoré and Sadou met once again under the baobab tree in Yaga village. This time they were joined by dozens of other people whose lives had been touched by the Zone 12 project, former rebels and former soldiers, conflict victims and community leaders, children who had grown up in peace, and adults who had helped make that peace possible. As the sun set over the thriving community that had emerged from the ashes of conflict, Sadou reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. It had begun with a pair of boots given to a hungry child, had nearly ended with a gunshot in a dusty square, and had ultimately become proof that even the deepest wounds could heal when treated with patience, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to the possibility of redemption. The story of Zone 12 was still being written, still evolving with each child who learned to read, each young person who chose education over extremism, each community that decided to heal rather than harbor grudges. But the foundation had been laid, built not on sand or stone, but on something more durable, the radical proposition that forgiveness, backed by genuine commitment to justice and opportunity, could be stronger than hatred. In a world still marked by conflict and division, Zone 12 stood as a beacon of what was possible when people chose mercy over revenge, when leaders had the courage to trust in the better angels of human nature, and when communities decided that their children's future mattered more than their ancestors' grievances. The seeds of change, planted in red earth watered by tears and blood, had grown into something beautiful and enduring. And in their shade, new generations were learning that another way was not only possible, it was inevitable, if they had the courage to choose it. Sometimes the greatest power isn't found in revenge, but in forgiveness. One act of mercy can plant the seeds of change, even in soil scorched by war. Sadou's journey reminds us that healing begins not with punishment, but with understanding. In a world quick to judge and slow to forgive, the story of Zone 12 offers hope that redemption is possible, that communities can heal, and that the cycle of violence can be broken by those brave enough to choose a different path.